Hello guys, so today we're going to be talking about A Sound of Thunder, which is one of my favorite short stories. It's by Ray Bradbury, and it is a science fiction story. So that makes it a little bit different from the straight up prose you may have read before or read in high school, but a lot of the stories that we're going to be reading in this unit are science fiction because I had to pick a theme and sci-fi was good enough. So what is science fiction? So sci-fi is not quite fantasy, and it's not quite dystopia. It exists somewhere in the realm in between. It usually involves commentary on society inventions, particularly on technology. A really famous sci-fi story would be something like 1984, which is sort of about surveillance. Another famous sci-fi story would be like The Time Traveler, which has to do with time travel. So usually it's commenting on man's folly and our abilities and disabilities with the technologies that we create. Sometimes we don't entirely understand our own creations. The inciting incident in sci-fi is caused by some development in science or technology. So think iRobot. That's a story we're going to be reading later on, or selections from iRobot. So the inciting incident in iRobot is that we have created robots, and that changes society to such a degree that people's lives are derailed by this sudden development. So the inciting incident has to be the development of science or technology. If, like in the Terminator, you turn on the Skynet and you get Terminators. So must be plausible, if not realistic. Yeah, usually sci-fi takes place in our world, or a world that looks pretty similar to ours. And it can take place on Earth or in outer space or on another planet. It can take place in the past. Rarely it happens in the past. Usually it happens somewhere in the present or the future. Think like Harrison Bergeron, which we just read. It takes place in 2081. So these are just some examples of different science fictions. You can see how many you can name. I'll give you a second. You can pause the video. But yeah, so these are all different sci-fi worlds we have here. Of course, the Terminator, we have Star Trek. One of the ways that we can tell the difference between sci-fi and fantasy is just think of the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Trek revolves around different instances of things going wrong with science or things going wrong with cross-cultural communication that revolves around science. So it's a science fiction story versus Star Wars, where it's more of a hero's journey, sort of epic story, which is a fantasy. So anyway, we've got Terminator, Star Trek. This is WALL-E and his buddy Eva, 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Martian, and iRobot. All of these are good examples of science fiction. So as I said, the things that we can think about to compare sci-fi versus sci-fantasy is Star Wars and Star Trek. These are two of like the more famous franchises in each of the genre. Star Wars is a hero's journey narrative. So we start with young Anakin Skywalker, who grows up to become Darth Vader, spoilers, and has a son who grows up to try to defeat the evil in the universe, right? This is a hero's journey. It actually has really nothing at all to do with technology. We have weird technology going on and also weird religion things like the Force. But it's not the technology, and interacting technology is not what the story revolves around. Versus something like Star Trek. So in Star Trek, it's science fiction. The plots revolve around interacting with technology, something going wrong on the holodeck, something going wrong with these augmented humans that we've created, something going wrong with androids, right? Like all of the plots revolves around something to do with technology. And it's also created a social commentary. So this is another big point for the sci-fi that we're going to be looking at, is not only do the plots revolve around some update in technology, but also they were created in order to commentate on the world that we live in. The original Star Trek is very notable because it has a Japanese American 20 years after we fought a war against Japan. It has a Russian American during the Cold War, has a black female officer on the bridge, right? So like it's making these commentaries on really big social events that are happening in the world in the 1960s. So yeah, we can do it in science fiction in a way that we can't do in regular fiction, because you can always use the excuse of, well, they're on a spaceship, so obviously it's not real. So it's a nice way to get away with commentating on the world around us. So usually the plot of a sci-fi story is introduction to new technology goes wrong, consequences. Yeah, when we get to iRobot, this is going to look exactly like what the stories are, right? We introduce a new technology, usually a new robot. The new technology usually immediately goes wrong, and then there are consequences for that going wrong. So, when we think about storytelling, a lot of the times students will ask me, what makes a good story, especially from like a writer's point of view. How do you know when you're writing a good story? And a lot of the times, people tell young writers that your character has to change over the course of the story. And this is often true. Usually, characters change by way of the story that we're telling. But I think of storytelling as a world that you're making where the world cannot be put back into the same box it was in before the story starts. I mean, you can think of a story like The Lord of the Rings, right? We cannot put the Shire back into the same box it was in before we had Sauron and the War of the Ring. So, at what point in the story are things so different that we can't put the world back into the neat and orderly place it was in before we began? And that's often what science fiction is asking us. All right, so this is probably the most famous passage from this story. It's one where, if you've ever heard of a little thing called the butterfly effect, that is taken from the story, where we talk about stepping on a butterfly's wing. All right, so this is from about 5 or 6 pages into the story, once they've traveled back in time, and they're talking about why exactly the time machine works and why it's important to stay on the path. What about the foxes? What about the foxes that'll need those mice to survive? For want of 10 mice, a fox dies, and for want of 10 foxes, the lion starves. For want of a lion, all manner of insects, vultures, infinite billions of life forms are thrown into chaos and destruction. Eventually, it all boils down to this. 59 million years later, a caveman, one of a dozen in the entire world, goes hunting wild boar or saber-toothed tiger for food. But you, friend, have stepped on all the tigers in that region by stepping on one single mouse. So the caveman starves. And the caveman, please know, was not just any expendable man. No, his entire future nation. From his loins would have sprung 10 sons, from their loins 100 sons, and thus onward into civilization. Destroy this one man, and destroy a race, a people, an entire history of life. It is comparable to slaying some of Adam's grandchildren. The stomp of your foot on one mouse could start an earthquake. The effects of which could shake our earth and destinies throughout time to their very foundations. With the death of that one caveman, 1 billion others yet unborn are throttled in the womb. Perhaps Rome never rises on 7 hills. Perhaps Europe is forever a dark forest, and only Asia waxes healthy and teeming. You can sort of tell where we are in history. We're talking about Asia waxing healthy and teeming. Anyway, step on a mouse and you crush on the pyramid. Step on a mouse and you leave your print like a Grand Canyon across eternity. Queen Elizabeth may never be born. Washington might not cross the Delaware. There might not be a United States at all. So be careful. Stay on the path. Never step off. So this is our big passage about, the importance of small things, right? Having large consequences. Something having a larger consequence is sort of the theme of a science fiction story. And then we also even have this really interesting description of a T-Rex. So one of the things that I would like you guys to do is to go back into the story and to look and see what descriptions we get. We actually don't get that many descriptions of time travel or what the Jurassic Cretaceous old-timey world would have looked like. But we do get this really in-depth look at what this T-Rex looks like. I mean, it has oiled, resilient, striding legs. Just count the adjectives in this passage. Oh my goodness. So one of the things that I would like you to try to do is just from reading this passage really quickly, just for yourself, try to sketch out what this T-Rex would look like. It's a lot of information here. I bet you could do it. And thinking about detail and the sort of detail that we can get just from reading something, we also get a bunch of detail in our regular lives just from looking at something. And so try to do the opposite here. Instead of drawing out what the description is, write out a description for this scene. What do you see happening here? Look at all these colors. We've got a lot of colors. We've got a ship. We've got a storm. We've got ocean. We've got something in the ocean over here and over here. So maybe pause the video and start writing down a couple of things. What do you think is happening here? If you had to write one paragraph of description, what would that paragraph be? What would the paragraph be called? I'll give you a couple of seconds. And then I'll actually tell you what this painting is called. So this painting is by an English guy named Turner, and he was known for his use of light. As you can see, lots of color in the light. And this painting is actually called Slavers Throwing Over the Dead and the Dying, which, like, wow, when you hear that, all of a sudden the painting takes on a very different appearance, right? And you notice that the things that are in the water are legs with chains on them, right? Like, wow, just naming something like this changes everything else about the painting. So, words have meaning. How we describe things have meaning. What we choose to describe has meaning. It's something to keep in mind as we keep reading this semester. This is just something to think about. Eventually, we're going to have to write an essay for the short story unit. And so something to think about as you sit down to write your essays. Should people be blamed for the accidental outcomes caused by their actions? Next week, we're going to be reading a war story, because we do sci-fi and war stories for the short story unit, called The Things They Carried, which is about death and who is responsible when somebody in a platoon dies. Is it the responsibility of the captain? Is it the responsibility of somebody further up? Is it the responsibility of the person who dies? Should people be blamed for accidents that they did not mean to cause? Right? In this story, should you be blamed for stepping on a butterfly? Just something to keep in mind, and to keep in mind as you go back to write. But reread the things, The Sound of Thunder, and take your quiz. And I will see you guys in our next video.